empezar hacia el cierre de la exposición. Sin embargo, pueden ir dejando sus consultas en el chat mientras avanza la exposición. Así que ahora le voy a dar el paso a Marcus. Marcus, welcome. Thank you very much for being with us today. So I let you continue.
Great. Thank you very much, Javier, and thank you very much, Paktan, to give us the opportunity here to present a couple of thoughts and some analysis. What I want to do in the next 15, 20 minutes or so is really take a very much a top-down approach, where I want to look at the geopolitics and how the geopolitics that we are currently seeing in the international system, how they lead to increasing economic fragmentation. And then at the end, I hope to have a few minutes left to talk about the risks and opportunities that arise from these really, really big trends that I'm afraid will be with us for quite some time to come. Could I get the next slide, please? So if we had had this conversation 20 years ago, or even 15 years ago, there was a sense that history had come to an end. There's a famous book by, as you may know, by Francis Fukuyama, who talked about the end of history after the end of the Cold War. But I think it's more accurate really to look at the world today and say, well, the end of history has really ended. And in a sense, we are returning to history, because what we have seen historically is geopolitical competition. And in a sense, the period after World War II, and certainly the period after the Cold War, which started in 1991, was quite unusual in the sense that there was a dominant power, the United States, and this power was able to, by and large, create stability, at least within its sphere of influence, and after the Cold War globally. So yet China joined the WTO, for example, Russia joined the IMF. So the system that was largely focused on what we used to call the West during the Cold War really went global. And this is important because it did generate a lot of prosperity over the past 20 years. You just have to look at China, for example, which came from nowhere, is a middle-income country today, but many, many other countries really had an opportunity to improve their prosperity by integrating themselves into this global economic order. But I would argue that this order was very much premised on this notion of American power and America's ability to, by and large, shape these relationships. The end of history also contained a thesis that liberal democracy would spread and would take over, and we'd all be a big happy family globally, where democracies, they cooperate, they don't go to war. There's a lot of evidence to show that democracies don't enter military conflict with one another. And it also seemed that after the Cold War and the demise of the Soviet economic system, there was only one economic paradigm, which was a liberal market economy. Something, for example, that Chile embraced in the 1970s, but then really sort of spread throughout Latin America in the 80s and 90s. From Brazil, and then of course also in Russia with reforms, and even to some extent in China. So this was the premise, and we thought, oh, we're going to live in the system forever, and prosperity will continue to increase. We have technological progress. We have technology moving from the center to the periphery, so the periphery also has a shot at becoming rich. But as I said, what I feel what happened here is that we are faced with a global scenario where we have increasing geopolitical competition, and that is largely driven by the fact that China has become more powerful. So if you look at the chart on the right, you see China's economic size is today larger than America's. And that leads to competition, because it means China has interests, it has global interests. Now it has the power to some extent to pursue those interests more aggressively. And this is where it clashes with the status quo power, which is the United States first and foremost. And this geopolitical competition is also underpinned by, to some extent, by Russian revisionism. So we'll talk about Ukraine in a second. Also by, to some extent, I fear it's more acceptable now to be authoritarian. In the 1990s and 2000s, there was a wave of democratization, and that's what everything was about. Today, we see, even in advanced countries, a reversal, a sort of degeneration to some extent of institutions and democracy. And even where I live in the United States, it's very clear that there's a real risk to democracy. And what we also saw, particularly the rise of China, is that, yes, China liberalized, but it never really became a complete market economy. in the way the United States is a market economy or Chile is a market economy. So there were challenges, but so in other words, you have geopolitical competition primarily between the US on the one hand and its allies and China on the other hand, but also you have different systems. I would argue though that this conflict is different because it's less ideological, like the way it was during the Cold War, but it's still two different systems. On the one hand, you have liberal democracy by and large, you have a market economy. On the other hand, you have a state-guided system of economics, and you have an authoritarian regime. I'm not going to opine on whether or not we would have this conflict if China were a democracy. This is a counterfactual that's very, very difficult to answer. But the mere fact is that today we are in a situation where we have a significant amount of geopolitical competition. And if you, for example, were to read the US National Security Strategy, which was published last year, it's very clear that China is seen as the primary threat to the United States, and the United States has to react to this. And this then leads to geopolitical competition. We get the next slide, please. And this has consequences. I'm just giving you two examples. There are many, many more examples. I'll be happy to sort of talk about others in the Q&A later on. But I think one consequence of this competition is arguably the war in Ukraine. Now, Ukraine has always been at the fault line of geopolitical competition between Russia and Western Europe. So in that sense, it's not really surprising. But because of Russia's arguable economic strengthening, it now put the opportunity to basically launch a war against the Ukraine. This is, analogy. This is about our security interests. This is about economic interests. But the point is that we are in this war, and this war already has had very important consequences. Things like we have rising energy prices, we had rising food prices, which led to a lot of problems in emerging market countries and developing market countries, because not only were these countries faced with like the COVID shock and the economic consequences, but all of a sudden they also were faced with like high food prices. And as you probably know, a lot of these countries are now in trouble and on the verge of defaulting. So you see how this geopolitical competition that is intensifying, at least for the moment, has real life economic consequences, which go way beyond the battlefield, which go way beyond Europe, which really then have a global economic impact. And so I think it's always good if you, whether you're running a business or you work in government or you're an academic or a journalist, to think about different scenarios. One thing is to say, okay, we are in this situation right now where we are faced with competition, but what will happen next? So it's always good to think in terms of scenarios. I think in the Ukraine case, it's relatively straightforward. I think there's broadly speaking, there's always a million different scenarios, but broadly speaking, there are three. Either we get a frozen conflict, which is where we were between 2014 and 2022. This would be a frozen conflict, of course, where Russia now has been effectively frozen out of the Western economic system. So Russia is now being forced to turn to China, which itself has sort of knock-on effects. Russia might be defeated. Then there's a very big question, what would happen next? I fear if it is defeated, there's a real chance it could break up. This would have very significant consequences in terms of nuclear weapons policies, nuclear strategy, but also it could impact the global economy because Russia, as you know, is a major producer, not just of important commodities, but also of energy. So it's really important to think about what might happen if such a scenario were to occur. I personally don't think it's very likely, but these are the kind of things I think if you, again, whether in government or in business, and you're looking out like 2 or 5 years, these are kind of scenarios I think you need to take into consideration to prepare for any eventuality. And then, of course, the scenario where Ukraine is simply defeated by Russia. I also don't think that's very likely for a number of reasons. But if it were to happen, of course, this will also have consequences, such as NATO would probably step up its defense expenditure. So there would be reallocation of fiscal resources in Europe and the United States. Different industry would benefit from this. So this is just a very long-winded way of saying that we are faced with intensifying geopolitical competition, and that has real-life economic consequences. And the more intense this competition is, and the more severe the consequences, the more you need to prepare for any eventuality. Take the next slide, please. The same, of course, that's almost kind of a twin crisis, if you will, when you look at Taiwan. There are many parallels here, also some differences. But Ukraine is at Russia's doorstep. Taiwan is at China's doorstep. So geostrategically, there's a lot of similarities here. Again, Taiwan is at the fault line of geostrategic competition between China and primarily the US and the US-led alliance. And Taiwan really sits at the fault line in geostrategic terms, geographically. I'm not going to go into the military implications of what were to happen if Taiwan fell to China, but clearly it would make China's position much easier and much more tenable, because Taiwan is part of the first island chain that kind of boxes in China and China's navy, and in fact also in an extreme scenario would allow the United States to effectively close off China and prevent it from trading with the rest of the world, at least conceptually. But Taiwan, as you know, is also a very important geo-economic actor because it is a major producer of chips. So if Taiwan were to stop producing chips, we would have a major economic impact globally. The car industry, many other industries would be badly impacted by this. So, and you wouldn't even necessarily need to have a military conflict here. Anything that simply prevents Taiwan from exporting chips over a longer time horizon would have a massive economic impact. And then that's perhaps less relevant in this context, but Taiwan also sits at the ideological fault line. So if you think about it, most US allies are democracies. China is an authoritarian regime. And for the US, it would be very difficult to abandon Taiwan for a whole range of reasons, but partly also because Taiwan is a thriving democracy. And of course, sometimes it's used by the US as sort of an argument to defend Taiwan, but really at the end of the day, the US has defended Taiwan for 70 years, whether it was a democracy or not. This is pure and simple about geostrategic interests. Again, you can play different scenarios here. Luckily, we are not in any sort of warlike situation at the moment, but you probably saw earlier this year, there was a lot of maneuvers and a lot of saber rattling. Personally, I don't think a conflict is very likely in the short run. Longer term is more difficult to say what will happen, but there are other scenarios. There could be a cyber attack. There could be military maneuvers. In a more extreme scenario, China could try a naval blockade. It would be very risky from China's point of view, but again, the point about scenarios is not that they are likely. The point is that if they were to happen, you should have a sense of what will happen next, and you should be prepared for these scenarios. And then, of course, the worst case scenario from a global economic point of view would be an invasion attempt, which would really lead to a regional war, no doubt. Would probably pull in Japan, would pull in Korea, the United States. And again, remember, you would have two nuclear states having a go at each other over Taiwan, and the United States would almost inevitably have to come to the rescue of Taiwan. And you can imagine what this would do. China is the world's largest economy. It's the largest international trader. So if something were to happen about Taiwan, you wouldn't necessarily even need a US naval blockade. I'm not sure how likely that is, but let's say that is a possibility. You wouldn't even need that for international financial markets and the international economy go haywire, because it would be probably very difficult to find anyone who's willing to ensure shipping and would continue to trade with China. So a very messy scenario. But the point here again is to say there are real risks that stem from this geopolitical competition that translate into real economic and financial risks. And even if you sit as far away as Chile or, well, Australia is closer to Taiwan, I suppose, or South Africa, it will still hit you because the global economy is highly integrated and commodity prices move. And if the US goes into recession or China goes into recession, you will feel it. And that's just, in a sense, a consequence of the fact that we live in a globalized world. So as I mentioned, some of the potential consequences, excuse me, at a very high level would have to do with chips. There might be a lack of supply of chips globally. This would have a devastating impact because everything you do, from working in the kitchen to making a phone call to being on the internet to driving your car, requires chips. What could also happen, of course, in that scenario is that China decides to not export particular commodities that are very important for US and European and quite frankly global industrial value chains such as rare earths. So in that scenario, you would have a huge disruptive impact on the global economy. It doesn't bear thinking what really could happen, but what I emphasize is this would have a huge impact because global supply chains are so integrated that this would cascade from rare earths to Europe, and from Europe to Latin America and all the rest of it. I'm sure there are some countries would be less affected, but overall it would be a very significant event. Also something that is worth thinking about, again, whether you're a government that is responsible for national economic security, or you're a company and you're responsible for accountable for your shareholders. These are the kinds of things that you really want to take in consideration. Can I get the next slide, please? Another thing, so switching gears a little bit, is so China's rise has been a very, very important story. And the implication of this is you have basically two very large economies, and China will continue to grow, albeit perhaps at a lesser pace. There's a range of reasons. I'm not going to bore you with this. We can go into the Q&A if you're really interested. I do think China is going to experience a significant economic slowdown. It faces a number of really important economic challenges. But at the same time, it's a big country and it will continue to grow. And the question then is for so-called middle powers, how will they position themselves in between China and the United States? And you might say, well, I'm sitting in, I don't know, in Colombia or Brazil. What's it to me? I can trade with the United States and China. But I'm afraid it probably will not be that easy. And again, here the question is how fragmented the global economy will become. And I don't think there's a 0-1 answer. There's going to be fragmentation in certain respects, maybe with respect to certain kinds of technologies, and there will be less fragmentation with regards to others. And I'm not suggesting that countries necessarily will be forced to choose overall between the US and China, but there will be increasing pressure coming, particularly from the United States, to align policies up to a point. What this then effectively means, that's another question. Again, something that we'd be happy to sort of go into in the Q&A. But just to say that another uncertainty factor is China is not going to continue to rise at the same pace that it has in the past 40 years. And if China were to go in a crisis, this would have global economic consequences, but it could also have domestic political consequences, which then could spill over the international realm. So a lot of uncertainties. We could talk about the US. The US has challenges as well, as we all know. But I think because China is on a higher growth path, what happens in China is more consequential, not just for the Chinese economy, but quite frankly, for the global economy. Okay, the next slide, please. I'm not going to go into these things. This is sort of very, very specific, but I just want to draw your attention to the chart on the upper left-hand side where you see the red line. So the red line refers to trade policy uncertainty. Now, don't ask me how the IMF measures this, but certainly what you see here is there's a lot of uncertainty about international trade. And to some extent, you see a spike in geopolitical risk as well. That's the green line. You saw a spike in 2000 and 2001. That, of course, was to do with 9/11 attacks in the United States and the wars in Iraq and so on and so forth. But now you see a much, much greater degree of trade uncertainty. And if you look at the right-hand side, the chart there, you see also a sharp increase in trade restrictions that were imposed in the past few years. And there's a variety of reasons for why these were imposed, but increasingly they are being imposed for security reasons. So that's what we call it, the securitization of international trade, where countries, particularly the United States, but not just the United States, also the Europeans and the Chinese, they're using a national security exemption under WTO to say we need to impose restrictions. And this is exactly what I mean by fragmentation. So you're moving from a relatively open trade system to one that's characterized by more and more restrictions and exemptions. And of course, it's typically the larger economies that impose more restrictions. And also, this is also, by the way, true when it comes to capital flows and investment. So investment used to flow relatively easily across border. Now you have not only more investment screening, so it's not quite as easy necessarily to invest in other countries. Again, it depends very much on who's the investor, where you're investing, and what sector are you investing. But the point I want to draw your attention to is the fact that we see an increasing fragmentation and increasing protectionism in the investment realm as well. That's very, very important. And then last but not least, you see the other chart where companies and countries, so both at the national level and the company level, they're very much thinking about how to mitigate those risks, how to mitigate the risks stemming from, say, a military conflict, how to mitigate risk from trade conflict, how to mitigate risk from export controls, and so on and so forth. So these days, if you go around and speak to CEOs and C-suite types and even the governments, they will talk about friendshoring, they will talk about supply chain resilience, and they're very much concerned about this. And I could go on and on about what the US is doing, what the European Union is also doing. The European Union is typically seen as an actor that is very much bound by law and legal procedures. But even the Europeans now have cottoned on to the fact that there's geopolitical risk, and they have launched a number of programs to mitigate those risks, like a raw material alliance. They're talking about export controls as well. So there's a bunch of things going on. And why is it relevant? It's relevant because if you're a very large economy, then you can do those things more easily. As a small economy, in a sense, you're a price taker. So you're part of a system that, say, 20, 30 years ago, or even 10 years ago, was very, very open. You could operate almost on equal terms, more or less. Now you're seeing the restrictions being imposed by the larger economies. China has always been relatively more restricted, of course, but the Europeans and the Americans imposing restrictions. And it's not just sanctions, just policy measures. And that will lead to fragmentation, and that will create a more uncertain international environment for companies. So if you want to invest in China and in the United States, you might well run into trouble depending what area you're investing in, because the US might say, well, if you're that engaged in China, you have a harder time, it will be harder for you to get and invest in the United States. So there's a whole range of restrictions. And so in other words, you can't assume there's a global economy that operates on a very liberal basis, multilateral and a reciprocal basis. You're now moving and working in a system where there's a lot of uncertainty about what is coming next. So just today, the US announced that it was going to introduce, for example, export controls on AI and chips. And this is going to get worse because as this competition increases between the US and China, both China and the US will want to defend themselves and make themselves less vulnerable to each other in this context of economic interdependence. So this is going to get worse. And as a third party, again, depending on who you are and what you do, you might just get away with it, but more likely than not, somehow you will be caught up in this conflict, one way or the other. And even if you aren't, I would so strongly recommend you think about how to prepare for this eventuality and think in a very detailed, but also strategic way about what this might imply and how it might impact you. Get the next slide, please. So the next slide is just sort of, I guess, a rehash of what I showed you earlier. There we are. So there's, in fact, some evidence that trade has increased among geopolitical allies, and trade has not really increased among geopolitical rivals. This is often referred to as decoupling. Europeans call it de-risking. But again, it speaks to the fact that certainly Europe and the US on the one hand and China on the other hand, they're in this uncomfortable position. And it does look like that allies will be trading more with allies going forward. At least that's certainly the risk. And here the position is, who are you as a country and how are you positioned? So this is quite natural because you want to trade with allies because it's less risky, because you run less of a risk of being hit by export controls or import tariffs. The same is also true for investments. So the right-hand side, don't worry about the numbers. Basically what it shows you is that investment has declined, particularly as it pertains to China. Again, there's various reasons. China faces rising labor costs, a more uncertain economic outlook. But a big part of it is that companies are, particularly foreign companies, Western companies, and in particular American companies, they're much more wary of investing in China because they don't know what the US government is going to do next. And also, they're very much afraid of getting caught in between the US and the Chinese government because the Chinese government can retaliate as well. Again, something that's perhaps less relevant for a company that's based in South America, but it sort of bears consideration that companies can end up in the geopolitical crossfire, as it were, not just when it comes to trade, but also when it comes to investment. Okay, the next slide, please. And I just want to end sort of on a very broad note. This is something I think the IMF produced. There's different ways of slicing and dicing this, but the question I think that countries' leaders should be asking is how, if we see intensifying geopolitical competition, which I'm almost certain we're going to see, there could be ups and downs, but structurally speaking, we're moving into a far more dangerous world, into a far more competitive, conflictual world on account of US-China competition. And inevitably, we will see geoeconomic fragmentation broadly along like US and China lines. So China's doing a lot of things to sort of decouple. The Europeans want to decouple and de-risk. I'm not saying we will see the emergence of economic blocs the way we saw it in the 1930s, or even like during the Cold War, where effectively you had two different blocks. I don't think we're going to go there, but there's still a lot of things in between that can happen. And the question as a country and perhaps as a region is, well, how should we position ourselves if that were to come to pass, and how should we prepare ourselves? And so here, when you see the red lines here, so that refers to Latin America and the Caribbean. And so one of the possibilities would be, for example, to Latin America, and I think, for example, Brazil wants to do that under Lula right now, wants to position itself in a relatively sort of neutral way, sort of cooperate with the US and with China. It's a possibility, and that may or may not work, but these are the strategic choices that governments, I think, will need to make, particularly if this competition intensifies. Of course, there's always the option of aligning oneself more with one country or another, but think of some countries. It's very, very difficult if 30% of your trade is with China and 20% with the United States. You really don't want to decouple from either of those. So you're really sitting in between two chairs, as it were. Again, I'm not so sure we're not talking about aggregate problems. Like, I think the fragmentation and the problems that arise will be far more sectoral. They will apply to technology, they will apply to rare earths, to specific imports and finances. So I don't think we get a complete breakdown where you have two blocks and you're really forced to choose one side or the other. But depending what sector you operate in, you might really end up in a very, very difficult position. But I want to end on a sort of slightly upbeat note, perhaps. This sounds all doom and gloom. It probably is all doom and gloom from a global economic perspective, because global economic fragmentation does translate into efficiency losses. So the world will be poorer off because of it, for sure. This was one of the advantages of globalization, that it really did allow to increase prosperity globally, at least. Sure, there were winners and losers, but globally prosperity increased. But there are also opportunities, and particularly for countries that are sort of sitting in between. On the one hand, they will be faced with a more difficult and challenging geopolitical environment. On the other hand, of course, they might also be countries that will become increasingly courted by China, the Europeans, or the Americans. And I just note that European leaders now come to Chile, and what do they talk about? Well, often they talk about getting access to important raw materials. So there are also real opportunities for countries and for companies and for sectors to exploit or to take advantage or to operate within this fragmented context, and if you will, take advantage of it. Despite the obvious drawbacks, there will be winners and losers. And again, it's one of those things that countries should be thinking about, and certainly companies should be thinking about, because this geopolitical competition and geoeconomic fragmentation thing is coming at us like a freight train, and it's best to prepare now and think about what might happen, so that the business or a country's prosperity is not too badly affected if it actually does occur. And I think I'll stop here and hand it back. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marcus, well, for all. Y ahora le damos el pase a Felipe Sandoval, que va a seguir ahí con la segunda parte de este Nettalk.
Solo quería asegurarme que estuviera tomando el tiempo para no pasarme. Gracias por la invitación y gracias a todos por asistir a la charla de hoy. Mi parte de la conversación tiene dos objetivos. El primer objetivo es de alguna manera hacer algunos breves comentarios o algún seguimiento de algunos de los temas que recién dio Marcus. Y la segunda parte está relacionada a la profundización de algunos temas que no fueron mencionados en la presentación anterior, por motivos de tiempo, obviamente. De todas maneras, Marcus, quedas invitado para la sesión de preguntas y respuestas, para también repreguntarnos entre nosotros, si fuera necesario y oportuno. Bien, entonces, lo primero que creo que hay que mencionar es que los temas de Ucrania, Taiwán, la relación bilateral entre China y Estados Unidos, ¿qué es lo que significan? ¿Cuál es el mensaje que está ahí detrás? Marcus utilizó dos términos. El primero fue incertidumbre, o sea, un escenario mundial visto desde la macrovisión geopolítica que es inestable, que es incierto, que es de un riesgo que va subiendo, increciendo a medida que pasan los años, lo que es cierto. Pero más interesante me pareció la lectura en el sentido que si llevamos este concepto de incertidumbre política, geopolítica, a la cancha del comercio o de las relaciones comerciales entre países, lo que estamos viendo en realidad es este fenómeno de la fragmentación económica, fragmentación reglamentaria. Yo quisiera referirme también un poco a este concepto, obviamente vinculado al hecho que yo he dedicado mi vida profesional justamente a los temas de política comercial, de política económica, y que por lo tanto tengo una sensibilidad probablemente mayor. Sobre esto, claro, Marcus tiene mucha razón en decir, es un fenómeno fuerte, es un fenómeno que tiene alcances globales, pero que no necesariamente se refiere a todos los sectores de la economía, ni entre todos los países. Lo que es cierto, por ejemplo, lo que hemos visto mucho suceder entre Estados Unidos y China, más allá de las subidas arancelarias que son las que aparecen por la televisión, es en realidad una suerte de guerra comercial que tiene su fundamento en este principio de la soberanía o de la seguridad nacional, pero que está vinculado a la producción, uso, venta y comercialización de tecnologías que son desarrolladas en un lugar u otro. Uno. Y dos, en el mundo van lamentablemente en aumento y un aumento dramático las medidas que están relacionadas a instaurar o instalar restricciones a el libre comercio digital, a la libertad de movimiento o a la facilidad con que los datos comerciales, personales, pero comerciales, pueden desplazarse o moverse entre una jurisdicción y otra. El desplazamiento de datos desde Chile a China, de China a Estados Unidos, de Estados Unidos hacia Chile. Solo dejen darles un ejemplo como para poder comprender esto desde la perspectiva de un chileno o de alguien que vive aquí. Cuando hace un par de años el gobierno, a través de una licitación, decidió que quienes debían producir o manufacturar los pasaportes en Chile iban a ser una compañía china, la reacción norteamericana fue de inmediata. Dijo, momento, usted tiene un acuerdo de facilitación de entrada al territorio norteamericano, visa waiver, eso implica que nosotros intercambiamos información con un grado de transparencia que es excepcional, y por tanto yo le exijo a usted, o yo elegantemente le recomiendo a Chile, que mire a otros proveedores, porque la relación que yo mantengo con China en lo que dice relación con la transmisión de datos personales, ya sean de mis nacionales norteamericanos residentes o de los residentes de países amigos que hago negocios con, está bajo ciertas reglas escritas y no escritas. Y la decisión, que en principio era definitiva, es decir, la licitación que ya había llegado al punto de otorgar ese negocio a una empresa de origen chino, tuvo que de alguna manera ser deshecho, y esa licitación tuvo que volver a hacerse. Y ahora, si mal no recuerdo, va a ser una empresa francesa la que va a estar a cargo de la producción de estos documentos. Y este es un ejemplo práctico de lo que sucede cuando, cuando un país como Chile queda un tanto en el medio, y se vio obligado a repensar, a reformular, a sofisticar su toma de decisiones. Me gustaría movernos al segundo slide. Y entonces, ¿qué significa incertidumbre para Chile? Visto desde un punto de vista comercial y también político. Lo primero que yo creo que es menester despejar, y que de alguna manera Marcus ya dio una cierta luz, es esta discusión en torno a que porque Estados Unidos y China, estos grandes monstruos, estas grandes economías, potencias mundiales, están en una suerte de relación bilateral en la que hay demasiadas fricciones, probablemente más de las deseadas y más de las necesarias, y dado que Chile tiene una relación comercial y por tanto política, porque ya es bueno que empecemos a pensar de esta manera, cuando pensamos en comercio, en política comercial, no pensemos solamente en negocios, pensemos que estos negocios se dan en un contexto político del cual no los podemos desprender, tenemos que comprenderlo y saber cómo navegar en él, pero no podemos negarlo. En fin, en este contexto, o sea, en este escenario complicado, muchas veces se plantea el tema que Chile está en una posición muy difícil porque tarde o temprano va a tener que escoger entre China, que le compra la inmensa mayoría del cobre, y Estados Unidos, su socio comercial más importante histórico, además de político, valórico, etc. Yo soy del grupo de personas que piensa que este es un dilema falso, que esto es un slogan, que es una manera de simplificar la realidad, que en realidad no nos sirve mucho a la hora de intentar navegar en un mundo multipolar y más complicado. Lo cierto, en mi opinión, es que Chile no tiene que escoger de manera definitiva entre uno y otro, ni entre China, ni por Estados Unidos, ni por India, ni por el Mercosur, ni por México. No estamos en una posición en que sea necesario hacerlo. Lo que sucede es que, porque nuestras relaciones comerciales se han desarrollado tanto y con tanta profundidad con grandes bloques económicos, y porque estos bloques económicos tienen intereses creados también en Chile, intereses que en su mayoría se relacionan al mundo de las inversiones, o de la compra de mineral o de inversión extranjera en Chile. En este contexto, Chile lo que debe hacer, o la política, la diplomacia comercial chilena lo que tiene que hacer es afinar la puntería para que sea un instrumento o un elemento adicional de juicio a la hora de tomar determinaciones, decisiones respecto de casos específicos. Por eso que es importante diferenciar entre escoger o tomar un lado o un bando de manera definitiva en contraposición a un escenario políticamente más complejo, que es más exigente para Chile, porque implica tener que tomar, por decirlo así, tener que escoger, pero en el caso específico, según las circunstancias específicas, según el socio que esté en juego y, obviamente, de conformidad a la magnitud del negocio que se intente cerrar o de la relación económica que se intente profundizar. Entonces no es una decisión definitiva, no es una decisión necesaria y por siempre, sino que es un ejercicio caso a caso, casuístico, difícil, complicado, que involucra al gobierno y que involucra al sector privado. La industria tiene mucho que decir y en la medida en que el comercio internacional sigue creciendo como proporción del PIB de Chile, que hoy día llega casi al 70%, el interés privado y el interés público tienden a coincidir y eventualmente se fusionan. En muchos casos el interés público y el interés privado no son distintos, son exactamente el mismo. Estados Unidos es el mejor ejemplo de esto. Como segundo punto alrededor de este asunto o de este problema de la incertidumbre es, bueno, ¿qué puede hacer Chile o un país como Chile frente a esto? Lo primero es lo lógico, no aumentar con acciones propias o de causa propia el grado de incertidumbre. Y lo segundo, obviamente, es intentar disminuirlo en relación a temas en que el país tenga pleno dominio o pleno control. Ejemplo de uno y ejemplo de otro. Hoy, en Chile existe un grado de incertidumbre regulatoria, política, que hace tiempo no veíamos. Estamos aún en el medio de un proceso de reforma constitucional o de construcción de una nueva carta fundamental, que más allá de las posiciones políticas y más allá de los temas específicos, mientras no se cierre, implica objetivamente una fuente de incertidumbre. Y, por ejemplo, los grandes negocios mineros, las grandes inversiones por miles de millones de dólares en la industria minera metálica en Chile en particular, y ahora también la del litio, implica que las inversiones extranjeras, como lo hemos visto en los últimos 5 años, han tendido a bajar en Chile. Hay algunas excepciones, hace 2 años atrás hubo un crecimiento importante, pero en general el flujo de inversión extranjera hacia Chile se ha recogido, y esto puede ser perfectamente indexado o asociado al hecho que en Chile mismo hemos tomado acciones o hemos creado condiciones que no favorecen a la certidumbre regulatoria, no favorecen a terminar con esta fragmentación económica, sino que por el contrario generan una condición de no saber hacia dónde va, una condición, de nuevo, de incertidumbre, que obviamente incide de manera negativa, en la mayoría de los casos, frente a una decisión o una posible decisión de inversión en Chile. Ahora, ¿qué podemos hacer? Como lo dije, creo que lo importante es identificar aquellas cuestiones o temas sobre los que Chile tiene control. Porque cuando hablamos de incertidumbre, claro, hablamos de factores que están bajo nuestro control y factores que no están bajo nuestro control. Desgraciadamente, la mayoría de estos factores, hasta ahora, provienen desde el extranjero, y Chile no puede hacer mucho para evitar la guerra en Ucrania, o para evitar que Estados Unidos y China continúen con esta relación friccionada, difícil. Pero sí nosotros internamente podemos tomar algunas medidas que vayan amortiguando de alguna manera esta incertidumbre, o que vayan introduciendo mayor grado de certidumbre a situaciones que por ahora o que históricamente han sido inciertas. Y aquí creo que, y lo digo también como ex negociador comercial de Chile, lo que podamos hacer bilateralmente o plurilateralmente, es decir, en grupos de más de 2, pero no de todo el mundo, es una suerte de relanzamiento o de reimpulso de la política comercial de negociaciones comerciales de Chile. Es decir, la negociación de acuerdos de libre comercio, el mejoramiento de los acuerdos de libre comercio, la expansión de los acuerdos de libre comercio. Sobre todo en un escenario mundial en que una parte importante de este fenómeno de la fragmentación tiene que ver, uno, y yo diría más importantemente, con el hecho que en los últimos 20 años, por ejemplo, o digamos desde principios de los 90, o para darle una fecha cierta, desde la creación de la Organización Mundial del Comercio, el año 95, el mundo de alguna manera, cuando digo el mundo me refiero a más de 160 miembros, el mundo de alguna manera ha venido acordando un piso regulatorio, un sistema de gobernanza mundial global económico que establece mínimos, pero mínimos que permiten de alguna manera aplanar la cancha mundial en materia comercial entre países. Y lo que ha venido sucediendo en los últimos 5 años con bastante fuerza es que muchos de los países que son parte de este club, que son parte de esta iniciativa global, han venido repensando su posición y de alguna manera ¿por qué no decirlo derechamente?, han buscado maneras de incumplir con estos mínimos establecidos. Y ese incumplimiento a veces está dirigido hacia un país en particular y a veces está dirigido hacia el mundo entero. Y en este escenario de poco respeto a la norma, en este escenario de poca producción de normativa de gobernanza mundial, de poca estabilidad, de poca predecibilidad de las condiciones para hacer comercio en el mundo, estos mínimos comunes, las acciones positivas que Chile pueda adoptar sin tener que preguntarle a nadie más, es decir, cosas que nosotros podamos hacer, una de estas es claramente la negociación y renegociación de acuerdos comerciales. Un tema o un país que no fue mencionado de manera explícita por Marcus, pero de seguro está en su mente, es la llegada de India al escenario mundial. Aquí lo primero que hay que decir, en relación a lo que recientemente estábamos señalando, es que Chile se adelantó a muchos países en el mundo, claramente a todos los de la región, y negoció un acuerdo de libre comercio con India al año 2006. Lo suscribió en 2006 y entró en vigor el 2007. De alguna manera, intentando anticiparse a este surgimiento, a este fortalecimiento de India como un componente importante, no solo del comercio internacional en términos de volumen, sino que como un actor importante en la fijación de estas normas comunes a nivel mundial. Además del crecimiento de su mercado interno, del crecimiento de India, o sea, del crecimiento del interés de India para el resto del mundo, lo que significan inversiones indias en el resto del mundo, en particular en países que tienen recursos naturales necesarios para el crecimiento, como por ejemplo Chile, litio, de nuevo cobre, transición energética. Y resulta que ese acuerdo que tenemos con India es un acuerdo muy incompleto. Es un acuerdo bastante pequeñito, que está circunscrito al mundo de las mercancías, de los bienes, y que básicamente le ha permitido a muchos productores nacionales de mercancías y, en este caso, de comida, básicamente, productos agrícolas de origen chileno, exportar de manera preferencial al mercado indio. Pero eso es claramente insuficiente. Y déjenme darles un ejemplo para probar por qué es insuficiente. Cuando Chile negoció el acuerdo bilateral con China, partimos igual que con India. Era un acuerdo parcial que se dedicaba al mundo de las mercancías. Pero ya en ese momento, los negociadores chilenos y los negociadores chinos entendían la importancia de ampliar este acuerdo comercial para cubrir temas, por ejemplo, como las inversiones recíprocas, la protección a las inversiones, el comercio de servicios, la liberalización del comercio de servicios, el comercio digital, normas comunes. O si no fueran comunes, al menos que pudieran dialogar entre ellas para facilitar el comercio. Y estos temas eventualmente se incluyeron con China. Yo tuve la suerte de participar en el grupo que negoció el acuerdo bilateral para la promoción y la protección de las inversiones con China. Y lo que ha sucedido a la fecha es que en la práctica se han triplicado, o más que triplicado, las inversiones chinas en Chile. Y esto de alguna manera prueba el punto de decir, bueno, ¿nos vamos a quedar con lo que tenemos hasta ahora o vamos a avanzar en la relación bilateral, la relación comercial, despejando incertidumbres? O dicho de otra manera, creando certidumbre donde no existe, generando condiciones que favorezcan el crecimiento y la inversión en Chile. Siempre mirándolo desde la perspectiva de nosotros. Siempre es muy tentador decir, bueno, sí, podríamos pensar en qué pasa con el flujo exportador chileno. Sí, es importante, pero China hubiese comprado cobre chileno con o sin TLC. Pero algo importante y que está claramente indexado, claramente relacionado al hecho de haber negociado un acuerdo bilateral de inversiones con China, es el aumento significativo en la inversión extranjera china en Chile. Eso no era así antes de la negociación del acuerdo. Para cerrar, los últimos 2 o 3 minutos, para que yo termine antes de las 7 y así tengamos a lo menos media hora de discusión, es hacer algunos puntos respecto de India. India creo que solo recientemente se ha venido incorporando a la discusión grande, a la discusión de la geopolítica, decir, bueno, ¿por qué es importante India? Uno, India es un país que este año va a superar, o se espera que supere en población, a China. Es decir, va a estar en alrededor de 1.3 billones de habitantes, más de 1.300 millones de habitantes. India es un país con una población joven. Más del 50% de las personas que viven en India tienen 30 años o menos. Esto es distinto en China, donde la población se está poniendo más vieja, donde la pirámide de crecimiento vegetativo va en declinación, y que obviamente presenta un desafío muy importante y de largo plazo, y a esta altura no son tendencias que se puedan corregir en 5 o en 10 años, para la nación china. Y obviamente esto tiene consecuencias en la fuerza laboral, en la obtención de recursos para sustentar la vejez de los que ya no trabajan, etc. Lo segundo es que India es, mal que mal, con observaciones, pero es la democracia más grande del mundo. Un sistema democrático, elecciones regulares, con observadores internacionales, que son herencia de alguna manera del pasado colonial británico en India. Lo que le otorga también a India institucionalmente una plataforma más fácil para dialogar con Occidente. India habla inglés también, aparte del hindi y los otros cientos de, bueno, múltiples dialectos, pero uno puede conversar en inglés con India, el inglés es el idioma del mundo, uno puede conversar institucionalmente con India porque preservó y fortaleció a las instituciones que quedaron instaladas desde el momento colonial. Y lo otro es que India es un rival de China. Tiene una tremenda frontera con China y es una frontera difícil. Hace 2 años vimos el enfrentamiento con armas entre militares de un lado y de otro en la frontera entre India y China. Murió gente. Esa es una relación difícil. Y eso de alguna manera da alguna indicación de, no voy a decir qué lado va a tomar India, porque no creo que tome ni un lado ni el otro. India no necesita ser ella misma con su propia política, pero creo que de alguna manera complejiza, pero también ayuda a ir descifrando y moldeando esa relación difícil, pero crucial que mantiene Estados Unidos con China. Así que Chile, ¿qué puede hacer? Evitar generar más incertidumbre, generar más certidumbre donde puede, utilizar su política económica, su política comercial elogiada en el mundo para profundizar esa sensación, esa percepción de certidumbre, aprovechar el surgimiento de múltiples polos de desarrollo en el mundo, tenemos plataformas comerciales y políticas que podemos ocupar, tenemos que completar aquellas que están incompletas, que necesitan mayor profundización, y el caso de India es paradigmático, necesitamos profundizar esa relación comercial y política, y necesitamos estar también muy conscientes, como decía Marcus, que el escenario hacia adelante no se viene simplificando, el escenario hacia adelante viene complejizándose. Pero Chile no está en una mala posición, y de nuevo, no tenemos que escoger definitivamente ni por uno ni por otro, pero nuestras decisiones caso a caso se complejizan en lo político, en lo comercial, en lo económico. Yo quisiera llegar hasta acá, porque creo que ya son las 7 en punto, y así podemos dejar la próxima media hora para consultas. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Felipe, por toda esta exposición y por toda la información que nos entregaste. Nuevamente, muchas gracias a Marcus. Y tenemos la primera pregunta de Nicolás Valenzuela para Felipe Sandoval. ¿Qué pasa en un escenario más complejo en que estas grandes potencias comienzan eventualmente un conflicto mayor donde la relación con los países comiencen a disputarse entre las mismas? En ese caso, el definirse para cada caso o frente a cada negocio va a ser más complejo. ¿Cómo lo ves?
Bueno, yo creo que la respuesta está un poco en la pregunta. Va a ser cada día más complejo. Y eso, bueno, eso es lógico, pero ¿cuál es el problema de que sea más complejo? Yo creo que el problema de que sea más complejo es que hay mayor posibilidad de que nos equivoquemos. Esto que sucedió con las visas, por ejemplo, más allá de que haya sucedido o no, ya es parte del pasado, pero hay que aprender. O sea, ¿sucedió por qué? Sucedió porque la toma de decisión, los elementos, los componentes de la decisión, no fueron todos los que tenían que estar presentes. La decisión probablemente se tomó solo a la luz de la ley de concesiones, que al final del día dice, usted tiene que escoger a quien le ofrezcan, o sea, a quien le ofrezca en teoría el mejor acuerdo, que es generalmente el más barato, y en igualdad de condiciones, el más barato. Pero ahí nada dice de consideraciones políticas. Ahí nada dijo de cómo podíamos relacionar esa toma de decisión con una consecuencia bilateral con Estados Unidos en el tema migratorio. Entonces, claro, en la pregunta, de nuevo, está la respuesta. Decisiones más complejas. Eso implica de parte de Chile que ya no podemos tomar decisiones desde compartimentos estancos. O sea, el Estado, el gobierno, tiene necesariamente que estar en coordinación con el sector privado y tiene que recibir desde el Estado un input, una alimentación de carácter política. Los países entre más importantes se hacen o entre más ricos se hacen, ven que su toma de decisión es más complicada, es menos clara. Hace 20 años atrás era claro que si Estados Unidos tenía una preferencia o frente a un asunto como la producción de los carnets de identidad o de los pasaportes, era o Estados Unidos o alguien en la esfera de influencia o de amistad. Por mucho tiempo, de hecho, los pasaportes en Chile se produjeron en Australia, pero ahora es distinto.
If I may, I would just add to this that I agree that I don't think we're at a stage where any country has to choose between the US and China. As a matter of fact, even if you look at the United States and Europe, they don't want to decouple entirely. But what we're looking at is a more complicated sectoral picture. So that's why the Europeans talk about de-risking. There's no way the Europeans would even be able to decouple economically from China on a larger scale. They simply can't. But what we have been seeing over the past few years is very specific technological decoupling, and that is certainly intensified. And a few years ago, we would be saying, well, certain types of things can't be exported to China. Now we're at a stage where the United States prevents US citizens from working for certain types of Chinese companies. And one thing I think is important to understand in this context is, and this might be less applicable to Chile, but broadly speaking, it's true, the United States has the ability to impose what's called secondary measures, secondary sanctions. So it doesn't just target China, it also, for example, by using the dollar or using certain types of technology, it has the ability to deter third parties from cooperating and doing business with Chinese entities. Now, that is a very aggressive measure. The United States tries to use it sparingly in cases like Iran or North Korea. But what I would say is, if the global scenario and competition intensifies to the point where, as the question suggests, where we enter a warlike scenario, then obviously the pressure stemming from the United States will increase tremendously. Now, in that scenario, I think we'll have many, many other problems because we'll have perhaps a global conflict. But either way, the United States has become more aggressive and will continue to become more aggressive. And if we ever were to get to a scenario where there is a shooting war, then the pressure would increase tremendously. And we would be moving more from a sectoral basis to like broader sanctions and secondary sanctions, in which case it would be difficult for some countries more than for others to stay away, or certainly their ability to make choices would be more restricted. And just one more thought, I agree, for countries like Chile, the best strategy really is diversification, whether it's in terms of signing new trade agreements, but it's important to have trade relationships with as many countries as possible, and ideally, of course, the larger economic powers. India might be one of those. I think India is certainly an up-and-coming country. It's a large country, as Felipe pointed out. In economic terms, it is relatively sizable. It is not a particularly open economy. It doesn't really trade all that much. And I'll give you an example that's, again, not all that applicable to Chile, but when I speak to European CEOs, say in the car industry, and they say, well, we know that we should be diversifying away from China as a market, because if something happens in Taiwan, we're going to lose a lot of money. And then we go to our chief economist and ask him and say, well, where can we diversify to? And they're saying India. And it's like, yeah, India is fine, but India sells less cars in a year than, in India, you sell less cars in a year than in China in a week. So just the level of development at this stage between the US and China means China is something that you almost can't avoid. And India is certainly up and coming. I agree with Felipe, but it's going to be long in coming. But again, it very much depends what kind of product you want to sell to India. And one last thought, I think India will be very reluctant to be pulled onto the US side, but I think it will be leaning towards the United States. And if you followed, for example, Modi's visit last week in Washington, DC, I think it's very clear you have China as a very important power, you got India, and the relationship between India and the United States will become closer and closer, not to the point that they become treaty allies, but they will move much, much more closer together. So it'll be interesting to see what comes out of this dynamic.
Thank you very much, Marcus and Felipe, for the answers.
Tenemos una nueva pregunta para Felipe o Marcus. ¿Cuánto el incidente de Wagner debilita a Putin? ¿Cuánto afecta a la incertidumbre del mundo? No sé quién quiere partir respondiendo esta pregunta.
Brevemente, después pasamos a Marcus, que seguro tiene mucho que decir también.
I'm sorry. Could you just repeat the question? I didn't.
Wagner.
Vale. ¿Cuánto el incidente de Wagner, debilita a Putin? ¿Cuánto afecta a la incertidumbre del mundo?
I'm sorry, the line is very bad. Could you just say that? I'm very sorry. Could you say it again?
¿Cuánto el incidente de Wagner debilita a Putin? The Russia situation.
The question that's in the incident.
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry. I could have read it all. I'm sorry. Yes. Okay. That I have to say, this is out of my remit. I'm a political strategist. I mean, I do think that this image of being an undisputed leader has cracked. I think it is a problem. The reality is, I think we just don't know enough about what's really happened. We don't know exactly who was involved. There's a lot of people who comment on this in the Financial Times and New York Times, and quite frankly, they have no information and they're just speculating as far as I'm concerned. I just don't think we know enough. But clearly, if you have 25,000 heavily armed soldiers marching on your capital and taking over military commands, it doesn't really reflect well upon you and the degree to which you're really in charge. I don't think this weakens Putin unnecessarily. I think it is certainly a sign of weakness, but I don't think it will necessarily mean his demise. But again, I would really caution and say we need really more information about like what's really going on here.
Yo estoy muy de acuerdo, y esto lo estábamos conversando ayer en una sesión preparatoria de la conversación de hoy. Y yo partí diciendo, mira, lo primero es que en un régimen de las características del ruso, la información es muy imperfecta, en el mejor de los casos. Hay mucha información que no conocemos, hay mucho secreto y hay mucha mentira, muchísima mentira. Y es muy difícil descifrar o siquiera intentar predecir qué va a suceder en Rusia o con Putin. Una de las pocas conclusiones que son obvias, pero son obvias para cualquiera, es que Putin es menos poderoso hoy de lo que era el viernes, y que está más nervioso hoy y es más peligroso hoy de lo que era el viernes. Y el bombardeo de ayer al centro de una ciudad en Ucrania, un centro con gente comprando, ninguna relación con un blanco militar es prueba de eso. ¿Qué va a suceder con el grupo Wagner? Bueno, sabemos que esa milicia va a ser formalmente absorbida por el ejército ruso. Sabemos que los vínculos de Yevgeny Prigozhin son importantes con el Kremlin y personales con el señor Putin, pero más que eso es difícil especular. Ahora, o sea, si podría hacer una reflexión quizás un poquito más general, pero muy atingente al conflicto ucraniano-ruso, y que también creo se aplica a otros países o naciones o sistemas autoritarios o totalitarios en el mundo. Es que yo creo que lo que ha quedado en evidencia durante el curso de la guerra es que la calidad de las decisiones que se toman en Rusia, contrastadas con la calidad de las decisiones que se toman en Occidente o en Ucrania, apoyada por el resto de Occidente, son muy dispares. O sea, las decisiones que ha tomado Rusia, no todas, pero en el grueso, han sido malas decisiones, o torpes decisiones, o decisiones, bueno, y han sido así porque en los sistemas o en los regímenes totalitarios, por decirlo de alguna manera, si bien hay mayor verticalidad y de alguna forma mayor rapidez en la toma de decisiones, las decisiones también no tienen muchos niveles, no hay tantas capas que vayan chequeando y rechequeando, mejorando, puliendo, introduciendo componentes nuevos, consideraciones adicionales sobre lo que finalmente se va a transformar en una decisión definitiva o final en un escenario dado. Y eso implica que el riesgo de error, que el riesgo de una mala decisión acentuado por por una actitud de aislarse, de tomar decisiones en un ambiente aislado de la realidad nacional y casi internacional, de alguna manera le dan una ventaja estratégica a Occidente. Decisiones que a veces demoran más tiempo, pero que pasan por más niveles de control, hay más capas en las decisiones de mejor calidad que tienen un impacto en el escenario de guerra concreto. En el caso de Rusia y de países con regímenes centralizados totalitarios, el riesgo de error y el riesgo de una mala decisión es mucho mayor. Siempre aislado, con pocos asesores, muchos escuchándose a sí mismo, yes men en muchos casos, muy poca reflexión crítica, y eso obviamente que atenta contra la calidad de las decisiones que se toman. Entonces, yo creo que ahí hay una ventaja evidente para Occidente y para Ucrania sobre Rusia. Y es una de las razones por las cuales yo creo, aparte de un montón de otras, que Rusia no tiene cómo ganar.
If I might just add sort of one thought to this, I wholeheartedly agree. If you look at Russian history, Russia's never really had a vibrant civil society, and it's always been a highly centralized system. There were certainly struggles between the center and the periphery, but periphery largely prevailed. But it also means there's never really been like a really like flexible economy, and that is a real problem. And what I would also say is, this is sort of tendentially related to it, this was a big mistake on Russia's part, because no matter what happens in Ukraine, Russia will emerge from this conflict massively weakened. It's already been cut off from the Western financial system by and large, from trade. Its most important customer, Germany, is sort of turning away. And I think it will be a long time before Russia will be reintegrated into the Western economic system, if you will. Now, of course, it has turned to China. There's certainly China is a large market. You can sell lots of things, but basically, to my mind, this makes it makes Russia more dependent on China. So in that sense, strategically, it's even a drawback from the Russian point of view. But just in economic terms, Russia before the war really only had energy and basic commodities to sell, and it did relatively well, but it didn't have a sort of vibrant economy that, for example, you have in parts of the United States where there's sort of hubs popping up here and there, and there's innovation happening. You don't really have that. And then if you add to this, early on we're talking about India as a country that is in demographic ascent and is a very young population. In Russia, you have a declining population by and large. The growth outlook is very bad. There's no more foreign investment. If investment comes in, it will come from China. So Russia is in a really, really bad situation. And by the way, if you just, and I'll finish with that, if you just take a step back and look at Russia's size, Russia's economic size, it's actually quite small. Now, for example, Russia is about the size of, smaller than Germany. So if you add France and Italy to the equation, yes, Russia has nuclear weapons, but it doesn't have the economic size nor the economic potential to be successful geostrategically in the long run. And I fear that this aggression in Ukraine just accelerates its geopolitical decline. Now, it doesn't mean that Russia is not dangerous. It has nuclear weapons. And as I mentioned earlier, fragmentation would be a significant risk also from a Western perspective. But it does mean that by and large, in the long run, it is really not very competitive, short of its nuclear weapons. But in economic terms, in financial terms, it simply isn't.
Thank you, Marcus. Javier, tienes ahí la manito levantada y estás con el micrófono apagado.
Sí, muchas gracias. Me gustaría hacer una pregunta que quizás nos saca un poco de contexto de lo que hemos estado hablando. Tiene que ver con un contexto mundial vigente, y me gustaría llevarlo a una suposición que tiene que ver con el desarrollo tecnológico. Hoy día se habla del desarrollo de la inteligencia artificial como uno de los desarrollos tecnológicos más importantes, quizás de la historia, pero por lo menos de los últimos años. Y ya hemos visto anteriormente que los desarrollos tecnológicos, las carreras por los desarrollos tecnológicos, también generan ciertos grados de conflicto, y quería consultar si se prevé que en el corto plazo pueda ser una variable, esta u otro desarrollo tecnológico, como un factor de incertidumbre también, en el sentido de que hoy día ya hay una carrera empresarial de grandes empresas por lograr hacer los mayores avances de inteligencia artificial. ¿Puede tomar esto también en el corto plazo un rol político, o eso realmente hoy día está muy fuera de mover la aguja a nivel global?
I'll have a quick stab at this. So I'm not an engineer. I do think we have precedents for technological revolutions. You had the steam engine. This always brought about massive transformations. My sense is that what we're going through right now is an even greater technological revolution. I mean, if you think about how many jobs will be affected, we got a steam engine, it affects a certain amount of jobs, but a lot of, back in the day, people worked in agriculture. But if you think of most of the jobs we do, at least in middle income and high income countries, we rely on information. And if you now have a machine that can do the work almost as well as you, then it's going to be a real problem. Now, it's also true, of course, it's also tremendously enhancing in terms of the kind of things you can do. Instead of sitting down and writing a 10-page paper, you can ask ChatGPT to simply write it, and you go over it and rewrite it. So, but I do think there's going to be a lot of jobs that will simply fall away. And you might, in that sense, economically speaking, it's a distribution problem, because surely societies can produce more with less. But the question is, how do you distribute the surplus? And those people who lose as a result of this technological revolution, will they be adequately compensated? There's a parallel in when it comes to trade, of course. When you open up to trade, there's some groups that lose and some win. The theory says in aggregate, both countries win. I fear it's going to be the same with AI, but what I'm more concerned about is going to happen very, very quickly, and it's going to have a massive impact. And I wonder whether politically we're in a position to respond to this quickly enough to avoid broader political and economic destabilization. But I'd be curious to see what Felipe thinks.
Mi pensamiento en esto, en términos de política comercial, es que este es uno de los temas, bueno, sino el tema más importante hacia futuro. Vimos de alguna manera el comienzo de esta fractura, probablemente hace 10 años atrás, cuando se comenzó a negociar el Tratado Transpacífico, el TPP o CPTPP hoy día, en que estaba toda esta discusión de cómo arreglar el comercio electrónico, la economía digital, principios de libertad de transferencia de datos, qué tipo de datos pueden estar protegidos, cuáles no, bajo qué principios, que en el fondo fue la negociación o el intento de negociación de guías, de elementos, de principios que fueran, sin restringir, pero que fueran iluminando o indicando un cierto curso para el desarrollo de la economía en torno a estas nuevas tecnologías. En el caso de la inteligencia artificial, bueno, yo no soy un experto particular en inteligencia artificial, de nuevo, no soy ingeniero, soy abogado, pero la fractura inicial ahora es clarísima, y en eso va a ser profundo. Y ese es un tema sectorial, por decirlo así, en que sí va a ser necesario optar. Quizás, de nuevo, no de manera definitiva, pero el mundo se está dividiendo ahí. Y esa división va a ser difícil de reconciliar entre China y Estados Unidos. El puente natural para intentar, de alguna manera, enhebrar desde una vereda hacia otra, es lo que reglamentariamente puede hacer la Unión Europea, que está en una situación obviamente de mayor dependencia con China y que por lo tanto no puede entrar en una lógica de enfrentamiento. Tiene que buscar una manera de acomodarla y de acomodarse a China. Pero esto es un tema en que yo creo que no hay mucha vuelta en términos de evitar que esta fractura ocurra y que se profundice. Y aquí el tema del comercio es un reflejo de un tema que está detrás, que es el tema de la política. O sea, hay que decirlo claramente, este tema no sucedería si China no fuera un régimen como es, ni Estados Unidos fuera una democracia. Si fueran los dos un poco más parecidos, la discusión sería en otro tono, pero no es así. Entonces, el mundo en eso se va a ir. Y bueno, eso se ha visto en varios lugares, en negociaciones comerciales, en la Organización Mundial del Comercio, donde esto es un tema casi tabú a esta altura. Y claro, y ahí Chile va a tener que, o países como Chile tienen que tomar de nuevo decisiones más complicadas, más complejas al caso específico. Y en el caso específico, por lo general, hay más flexibilidad, pero en lo grande la flexibilidad es poca o ninguna. Pero en el caso específico, por lo general, uno puede intentar ir acomodando o ir acomodándose.
Muchas gracias. Creo que no hay ninguna otra pregunta. Si es así, ya siempre también faltando 5 minutitos para que acabemos, le doy la palabra a nuestro querido director ejecutivo, Javier de la Maza, para ir cerrando.
Bueno, darle nuevamente muchas gracias. Muy interesante la charla. Gracias a Wingward, particularmente a Marcus, a Felipe, por esta interesantísima charla de ver cómo el contexto internacional está afectando la incertidumbre y los desafíos que se vienen. Tuvimos un muy buen número de asistentes. También darle las gracias a todos los que están aquí cerrando con nosotros. Y bueno, vamos a publicar después con su autorización esta charla también para que podamos seguir compartiéndola con la comunidad, con nuestras alianzas que también colaboraron con la convocatoria de esta charla, con Brota, con Datneo, con Banca Ética, que tienen muchos inversionistas dentro de sus redes y que seguro toda esta información les va a ser muy relevante. Así que agradecerles y esperamos poder también seguir contando con ustedes para una futura ocasión.
Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias a todos y que descansen.
Muchas gracias
Muchas
a todos.
gracias.
Gracias, Javier. Gracias, Antonella.
Gracias.
Muchas
Que
gracias.
estés bien.
Gracias.
Luego.
Chao, chao.
Grande Marcus,
Chao,
grande
chao.
Felipe.
Chao.
Gracias, adiós.
Thank you, Marcus.